Through my presentation, I'll give a brief definition of Stigmergy and what my research question and motivation is, along with our anticipated outcomes and progress to date. The bulk of the presentation will be presenting the model of Stigmergy and going on to ongoing work. So has anyone here heard of the term Stigmergy before? Could I see a show of hands? Yep. Okay. It's a term to describe a phenomenon originally coined in 1959 by a French zoologist, Pierre-Paul Grassi. He introduced it while trying to describe insect behavior, specifically at the time what was considered the decentralization coordination paradox, trying to describe how seemingly unintelligent agents such as insects were able to coordinate with tasks such as food foraging and nest building. Grassi's work focused on pheromones and trails in the environment. More specifically, his definition was a process by which agents communicate indirectly between one another through their environment, the emphasis being indirect communication. Through the past few decades, there has been more and more interest in this phenomenon, and it's being picked up more in multi-agent systems and computer science. And over that course, the definitions have started to be a little bit more refined, with an additional where behavior of agents is influenced or determined by behavior of agents interacting with the spatial and temporal environment previously. And more importantly, getting into the computer science and autonomous system enabling self-organization, self-optimization, and self-contextualization in a lightweight and scalable environment. Scalable mechanism, sorry. So we also see a very similar parallel within the web, and our research is very specifically with software architecture, where websites are built with a specific, what we term the grand purpose or a common goal for why individuals will use that website. The main components of Stigmergy are the environment and the agents in them, but as well as the signs, which is are the trails and pheromones or the data that the agents are putting into that environment. The attributes and dynamics of an environment is specifically what the website as an environment does as far as a flux and transition to that data or contributions. We see examples in Web 1.0, such as Facebook like button, Wikipedia's NPOV tags, and eBay bidding.
It's bad audio, it's not working very well in the back.
Okay. Is that better? Okay. When we look at the research of Stigmergy, we see that it's a heuristic, not an algorithm. And we see a lot of work where there's replication of the behavior seen in various sorting and clustering, such as ant algorithms, pheromone evaluation, and trail reinforcing. Mostly when people are modeling Stigmergy, they're getting a right or a correct answer. But what is more important is that it's a reliable answer over the long term, and specifically for NP hard problems. So our research question is whether we can build a better collaborative Web 1.0 environment using the attributes and dynamics of Stigmergy. We're investigating of how we can actually do that and exploit Stigmergy. So the research motivation is primarily because of the scalability of the system. I'm only a part-time PhD student. For the past 20 years, I've been a software programmer, engineer, currently a software architect. And one of the biggest problems I see, especially when developing systems, has been how to make them inherently scalable as opposed to having to sit down and ensure that that's designed into each and every system. The research is also motivated by the robustness of Stigmergy, and we see this as the intentional actions of users within these websites providing instruction or opinion, as well as unintentional actions that indicate trustworthiness. We also believe that we can do better than just like buttons that you've seen in Facebook. Now, this research has been going for the past 4 years, and probably over the past 6 months, we see a lot more maturity in the way people are building websites, providing more than just a binary like ability. In fact, you see more and more people wishing for a dislike button in Facebook. But we believe we can do this by the actual application architecture adding value and designing the weblogs and the interface to be able to facilitate Stigmergy. So the subproblems of the research is to create an abstract model, clearly identifying the attributes and dynamics, which is presented in the paper for this conference, along with case studies of specific websites that we consider successfully implement Stigmergy within it. One thing I'd like to say is with Stigmergy, we don't consider that the entire site is stigmergic or not, but particular streams of site functionality might to some degree implement what we consider as Stigmergy. But going on with subproblems, we're analyzing the data from our case studies, validating the model's efficacy, and we're now starting to progress into designing a methodology and how that will transition into a framework to be able to design and build Stigmergy into these systems. So, not wanting to confirm the antecedent there, the outcomes are going to be primarily building the model, producing the methodology for designing these sites, and an architectural framework and tool set to be able to build them. So progress to date, we've finished the content analysis of the literature, synthesizing out the attributes and dynamics. We've created a series of 4 questions on how to identify Stigmergy within a particular environment. There's the abstract model presented in this paper and the initial case study. And the first iteration of this raised some perplexing questions, and specifically in a lot of the research, once you get from mixed method going into entomology and into the computer science, a lot of sociology papers just say that Stigmergy can only be considered as a metaphor once you get into human or web systems. People with their cognitive ability are just too sophisticated. That was the impetus of this paper. The working title of it was Freedom of Choice in the Web. And our opinion is that for the most part, depending on what site providers are intending their site to deliver to users, you really have a cut down instruction set that limits what you can portray onto a website as far as what you might be thinking cognitively. We've also considered how we can differentiate between contributors and vandals or defacers. But again, reviewing the literature, we consider that this isn't really something to be too concerned about. In fact, it's part of the robustness inherent to Stigmergy that using the power of the crowd will wash out the small number of people who aren't really subscribing to the grand purpose of the website. Again, as addressed in this paper, we've identified whether or not people are sharing part of the grand purpose on, for example, eBay. You have sellers wanting to maximize what they will sell a product for, buyers trying to minimize that and then competing against other buyers. But we consider that they're still all there with this grand purpose of having an environment where they're able to buy and sell goods. So they may have small facet alternative goals or agendas, but the grand purpose still persists. So the series of questions, and I have an asterisk up there because I've modified these and need to add an erratum The change has been with question 1, there was, does the agent intentionally leave a physical and measurable difference? Question 4 was, is there an unintended emergent trace? The model has progressed since submitting this paper, and those 2 terms have been removed just to clear up some ambiguity. But looking back at the previous definitions of stigmergy, the purpose of these questions, question 1 is identifying whether it's an environment-mediated communication as opposed to more direct observations, such as in behavioral implicit communication. Question 2 is more about whether the sign is actually part of the whole grand purpose, or is it just an incidental byproduct of something else completely unrelated. Similarly, question 3, for it to all be part of the grand purpose, that sign needs to be able to be perceived by an agent and appreciate that it's part of the whole grand purpose. And finally, stigmergy has an emergent facet where there's an additional implicit communication. So we have 3 major flavors of stigmergy, and they fall within explicit or implicit. And people will consider pheromones or trails to be the same thing, but they're quite different. Pheromones are a marker-based, and they can either be a qualitative or a quantitative. And an example is NPOV is, within Wikipedia, is an instructive, single qualitative trace for people to respond to. And within Facebook, you have a quantitative trace as a like button. And what is more important about that is the aggregation of that quantitative contribution having a higher probable potential for causing a behavioral reaction. With implicit, we're talking about trails and semitectonic stigmergy, and the standard example of what semitectonic stigmergy is trails which have been worn in the grass because people are taking a shortcut across them. The definition is a byproduct of actions contributing to work. And in layman's terms, that is, when you're walking across a lawn, your primary objective is to get to the other side quickly. You're not interested in trying to leave a trail there for other people to see. So when we're identifying stigmergy, we have the matrix at the bottom, and either you will have an explicit unintentional trace, which is a sign, but going back to our questions, when it's actually left with intent, that's when it actually becomes a signal and forms part of stigmergy. Similarly, for semitectonic or implicit, if you are walking along and unintentionally leaving this byproduct of your actions, then a trail will form, and we consider that stigmergy. Otherwise, it's a counterfeit. And here we start seeing why stigmergy as a phenomenon starts becoming more robust, or quite robust, because it becomes very expensive to be able to produce this counterfeit or to invest the resources to try and create a significant signal. So going on to the model, the 3 major components of stigmergy as mentioned are the agent, the sign, and the environment. And we have the attributes which are the major facets we consider important for each of those components. So for an agent, we have progress, completion point, goal, and strategy. For the sign, we have contribution, position, significant dimensions, and decay rate. And for the environment, we have erosive factors, the topography, the level of difficulty introduced to traverse it, and its ability to signal or turn that sign into a signal back to the agent. On the outside of this model, we have both interfacing and internal dynamics, where either an agent is able to sense those signals, evaluate them against its own internal attributes, actuate them back as a contribution to the sign, and then for that sign's ability to be eroded, entrified, and sent back to the agent. The circular nature of it indicates the temporal dynamic. So applying the model, within the paper, one thing I'm not happy with what I've presented is there are a lot of disparate examples for each of the different attributes and dynamics, and it lacks continuity to try and put the point across. So with this example here, we're taking a single specific facet of Stigmergy within eBay, which is the bidding, and we'll go through and have a quick look. I'm not sure how I'm doing on time, so I might skip the next couple of slides rather than have everyone's eyes roll into the back of their head. But with bidding within eBay, we consider that it's a semitectonic flavor of Stigmergy, and that's because bidders are intentionally bidding to win something. They're not interested in leaving a trail, and yet there is definitely a trail left behind presented by the environment. This is definitely a product of the behavior or their actions. The sign content is a collection of independent bids increasing in value, which have to be submitted before a subsequent bid of a higher value. And the environment providing an embodiment portrays this collection of bids as a reverse chronological list. And it includes the time and value linked to the sale item. And we think that this is very important to what then becomes the meaning for the agent. And I think the important point here is the vector of how the auction is going. And that's specifically the rate of bids, the level that they're increasing in value, and how quick it's getting to the end point of the auction. Now, going through the attributes of the sign, when we look at this case study point, the position, we see the sign that is allocated against the current item. The contribution is a successful bid added to the sale trail, and by successful, we consider that it's received prior to other higher bids and the end of the auction as higher than the previous bid. It has significant dimensions, which is the frequency and increase of values. And here's where we start getting a bit of complexity, where there's a couple of different perspectives. The sellers, whether they're adding a significant dimension of a reserved value or auction duration. And for the buyer's perspective, understanding the actual real market value for this item, current personal financial capability, or also whether they're running out of time to make their bids. The decay rate of the sign, which we define as the actual sign's ability to resist decay or resist erosion from the environment, is pretty much tied to the auction end time, but also having no ability to withstand some of the site's imposed erosion, such as once an auction has ended, whether or not the details of that are then searchable. Now, this again has changed just in the last month or two. I noticed on eBay that for some products and categories, they'll provide a summarization now of historical data of a categorized product and what previous sales at particular dates have been. So we're chasing a moving goal here, but that's okay. And similarly, sometimes Google has artifact leftover deep links to some auctions, and you'll come across them and it'll tell you that it's been concluded or relisted, and you can follow it. But as far as the site goes as a contained environment, it's providing an erosive force against this sign. So again, the environment, erosion, reverse chronological order, the site stipulates the latest valid bid is the sole focus of the auction. The topography, we get back into graph theory of web environments and difficulty. Again, it's a little bit of a soft system because we introduce geographical shipping restrictions, and not just for a person, but the site's ability to specify whether or not you'll do international shipping. And as well, reputation, which is another stigma trail, but again, it is overlapping and impinging on this particular facet's difficulty. Finally, the signal diffusion, whether or not you're building into the site the ability to alert users of upcoming auction conclusions. We see all of this. The environment very much is the focus of interest for where this research is going, because that's obviously what we're implementing. Finally, the agent. This, I think, oh, have I gone over? Okay. So, again, you see how it's going for the flow of a particular stream within one of the case studies. And again, the dynamics, I think this goes back to the previous presenter's comment about bringing in a qualitative assessment of what's happening and tying that in with what we're trying to achieve, as well as bringing in quantitative data. So, following the submission of this paper, I've realized that I've prevented a model and accepting everyone to take it on good faith. So I've gone back and done, currently working on another paper, which is a complete ground-up reanalysis of the literature review content, creating a full trail of evidence as to why some papers from entomology and other papers from sociology are using some terms as opposed to others, and where we discard some and generalize others. We're going through reviewing the case studies and trying to consolidate what kind of user interface functionality it will transition to when we're talking about the framework and the tool to be able to build these sites using some kind of methodology and case tool. And finally, this methodology, WebML, similar to UML, but specifically for building websites. And we're looking at how, when we do the transition from our theoretical and put it into implementable, how that can fit into some kind of existing tool so that we're not reinventing the wheel. Finally, one large outstanding question for this project is, once we have developed something which becomes usable and able to build a website, how are we going to test it for its efficacy? Obviously, when we're looking at the existing sites that we're doing case studies on, they have a phenomenal number of users, and that is going to be one of the biggest hurdles for how we're able to generate enough traffic or interest to be able to test it through some kind of experimentation. So that concludes my presentation. If there's any questions, please.